Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Excuse me. Today is a solo episode. I'm going to talk about my stress bucket analogy and how it can impact your body composition change and how you feel and eventually lead to worsening health over time. And this is where I think a lot of people in today's modern environments are at, especially when we're trying to change our body composition. The things we're doing are leading to it having too small of a stress bucket, and then it's constantly overflowing. And this again is going to make adaptation tougher. You're going to have lower willpower. We'll talk about what all those things look like, but I truly believe that we can trace back a lot of issues by just having, again, an overflowing bucket, whether it's just a small bucket or a just large bucket that is you're just trying to fill it with too many things. And we'll talk about what those are as well too. But first, before I go into that, so I just did my body recomp workshop. If you missed it, I did record it. I did go over the stress bucket in this, but we'll obviously spend a little bit more time here on the stress bucket concept today. But I did go over it in there, among many other things. And so if you're interested in checking that out, the link to that is in the show notes there. And then, so let's dive into today's topic around the stress bucket. So again, I want you to envision, if you're listening to this, I want you to envision a bucket, okay? And we have everyone's stress bucket is going to be different, right? This will be based on genetics, and we do have the ability to build it over time, and we'll talk about how we can do that. But I want you to envision a bucket that's being overflowed, and it's just constantly, you're trying to put more stuff in, and it's just overflowing, right? Water's coming out. It's just constantly coming out there, right? And so again, when this happens, that just means that whatever we're doing right now, we're exceeding our capacity of what we can handle. And like I was saying, modern life loads our stress bucket. There's many different sources of stress that fall into this, maybe some that you don't necessarily think are, and we'll dive into what those are. We're going to dive into the sources of stress, what happens when the bucket overflows, and then what can we do to keep it from overflowing, so then that way we're able to make change. Like I said, I think most issues that people experience in today's modern environment are essentially just an overloaded stress bucket, right? So again, any issues that somebody's having ultimately comes down to just overloading stress bucket. So again, whether this is testosterone issues, hormonal imbalances, insulin resistance, PMOS, like all these things, low energy, et cetera, all these are going to stem from, hey, there's just too much stress on the system somewhere, and we need to figure out where that's coming from. And we, over time, want to, if you want to, and most people should want to, increase the size of our buckets over time there. So again, if you are, and even cortisol, right? Let's take cortisol. Again, this is intertwined with cortisol, but if you have some issues with cortisol, a lot of people will be like, oh, my cortisol's high, right? And they blame it on that. There's likely some things that you're doing that are leading to those issues, and all that can be traced back to an overloaded stress bucket. I just think in some form or fashion, we can trace this back to that if we go deep enough with things here, right? Again, you could, like I said, really trace back anything to that. So let's first start with the overall arching concept, right? So again, your body has a limited capacity to handle stress. And when total stress exceeds your capacity, the bucket overflows. And when our stress exceeds capacity, again, that water is overflowing, and that's when problems start to show up over time. There's probably some things that happen in the short term, and then there's some more longer term adaptations, right? Again, those longer term adaptations are going to be, like I said, likely fat loss resistance, harder time building muscle. Again, people run into menstrual cycle issues, lower libido, testosterone issues, thyroid issues, all these things, right? Again, doesn't necessarily just happen overnight. Those are longer term adaptations. Again, you will see some things in the short term that do start to creep up, right? And again, it can be helpful to track those. So we'll also go over what that looks like in terms of what are some signs that this is happening in the short term as well too, so you can nip it early. All right, so let's first start with, actually, let's go over when the bucket overflows. So again, there's going to be less adaptation. So it's going to be harder to build muscle, lose fat, and improve performance. Again, the body's just going to be in the state where it's, okay, hey, we just have too many things coming in. We can't, we all have a limited amount of energy that our body can allocate towards certain things, right? And when we start to, exceed that budget, the body's not going to prioritize building muscle. It's not going to prioritize losing body fat. Its main goal is to be like, all right, hey, what's going on? We have this constant threat going on. We don't want to add muscle here in this situation, right? And then same thing, your body's probably going to be a little bit more resistant to fat loss. And I think some of it's going to come down to a lot of things that, in terms of the state that you're in, it's just going to be tougher to make fat loss happen too, right? So it's probably a physiological thing that makes your body a little bit more stubborn to lose body fat. However, at the same time, it's probably also, okay, when you're constantly stressed, your willpower is lower, you're probably rushed eating, your motivation's lower, you're probably not on track. So then hunger is going to be dysregulated, right? And so it's just this downstream impact there where it's probably a little bit of a direct, but also largely indirect aspect of things, right? Because you probably could have somebody that really can white knuckle their way through having a very high or overloaded stress bucket and lose some body fat, it's just going to be really hard. They're really going to have to white knuckle their way there. And then same thing with building muscle. But then the problem becomes then you can't really recover as well and everything like that. So we're just going to see less adaptation from our training. We might also just feel when our stress bucket's overloaded, we're just not able to push our training as hard, right? So you're not able to really get that extra gear going in your training, which in turn is going to impact your ability to add some muscle there. And then from a performance perspective, you're just not going to perform as well, right? So then your cardiovascular fitness probably isn't as good because you're not really pushing that as much as you're able to. If you do have some sort of performance related aspect of training that you want to do, whether that's you do some hikes or you do competitions or anything, or you play a sport, like you can expect that to be impacted in this state as well too. Like I said, lower energy, strength, endurance, and mental focus. I think the mental focus is the big one too. Again, that's going to be a huge piece of this, where once we start, again, mentally, this could start to impact your work as well too, right? You may find that you're now starting to be more irritable. Things that maybe didn't necessarily set you off before now continue to set you off, right? So again, maybe you're a little bit more irritable in this state. And this isn't, you can't, if you get irritable one day, you can't just say, oh, hey, my stress bucket's overloaded. That could definitely be one of the things, but generally speaking, you will find that that's the case, right? You're just going to be irritable, right? Things that maybe didn't bother you as much will start to bother you a bit more. And that's the other thing here with this bucket overloading is once it is starting to overload, it's any stressor that you did have, or that any stressor you do have from then on out is going to come at a higher recovery cost, right? So you can really dig yourself into a deep hole here if you don't get out ahead of this at some point in time. And this can start to trickle down there because again, every stressor is just going to be even worse. And maybe some sort of stressor that you were able to have happen, recover, and then go back to baseline. Now it's going to impact you more, which means it's going to have a bigger response. And now it's going to take you longer to get back to baseline as well too, right? There really is a synergistic effect here, a compounding effect here of this if we continue to let our stress bucket overflow. But again, you'll see fatigue, you'll see poor sleep. Again, those hormonal imbalances like we talked about, things start to become out of whack there. We're at a higher risk of injuries. I think of this too as a state of where your nervous system's just amped up all the time, right? And you start to feel pain a bit more. Injuries are high. Like I said, things do seem to hurt more. Again, for women in their menstrual cycle where they have bad cramps, again, it comes back to a overloaded stress bucket, right? And that's going to make all these symptoms much worse. Illness, right? You're going to be at a higher risk of getting sick. So if you've been getting sick more often, again, that's a sign that your stress bucket's overflowing. Again, mood issues, right? Maybe you're just a little bit more burnt out with things that you're doing. Maybe again, you're snapping a bit more at people. Like those are all signs that your stress bucket is overloaded. But again, we can't just say that, hey, one day you're in a bad mood, your stress bucket's overloaded. Maybe that's the case. Maybe you are starting to take on too many things and you can nip that in the bud early. But you also have to, if it's like, all right, for multiple weeks on end now, I've been super burnt out. Maybe I'm a bit more depressed. Maybe again, I've been snapping a bit more. I haven't been able to focus as well. Like that is a sign that your stress bucket's overloaded. Now, where it can get confusing is you do have to then figure out, okay, where are these stressors coming from? And that's what we'll do today because we are going to go over the sources of stress as well too. But your recovery is impaired, right? There's that slower recovery. Like I said, once your bucket's overflowing, any stressor you do put on your body, there is that slower recovery. And it's probably also because each time you do that, it has a larger impact. That stressor, let's just put a number on it. Let's say that stressor was a 5 out of 10, right? You do the exact same thing when your stress bucket's overloaded, and the longer it's been overloaded, now that may be a 7 out of 10, right? And because that's a 7 out of 10, that's going to have a higher physiological cost to it to recover as well, right? And so again, you may find that your training is just taking you longer to recover. You just feel a little bit more sore and beat up there, which in turn, now you're less motivated to train. It doesn't feel as good to train. And now we have more frequent setbacks. We're not able to push our training, right? So those are some things that can happen when that bucket overflows. And then obviously over time with that, there's some issues. We talk about cortisol. With cortisol, it works on a circadian rhythm. And cortisol is a good thing, right? We do need it. It can be anti-inflammatory until it's not, right? Until there's that kind of chronic high levels of cortisol. But also at the same time, it's a system that needs to be regulated, right? And so again, it does have a circadian rhythm to it. It should be higher earlier in the day, and then it should come down. Now, again, within that, when you do provide stressors or things happen, it may come up a little bit, and that's okay, but it's all about how quickly does it come back down. If our stress bucket's overflowing, again, you're going to have a higher cortisol response, and then it's going to take it longer to come back down. And then over time, when this is happening, your body can become somewhat insensitive or desensitized to that cortisol, right? And so then what happens there is now our system becomes dysregulated, right? Maybe you get a heightened response. Maybe you get that prolonged response where now it's staying higher longer than it needs to be. And then that in turn now is going to impact your circadian rhythm, right? Again, if we start to have these stressors later on in the day, we can't bring it back down because our stress bucket's super high, or we don't have healthy ways to manage our stress. That's again where we can start to run into some issues here. And then all these things happen with that, right? So again, usually with cortisol, it's not that cortisol itself is the issue. It's usually if somebody thinks they have some sort of cortisol issue, it's usually stemming from, again, some there's likely some dysregulation within that system. And so then the goal is, okay, how can we get this back on track? We'll talk about circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythm is a big one, but also some stress management stuff. And again, reducing the amount of stress that we're putting on our body there. And I think what's going to be super helpful for everybody listening today is going to be this, maybe there's some things that you aren't thinking that are stressors on the body, but they are, right? Because again, this now brings me to my next part of sources of stress. Most people think stress is essentially, hey, I feel stressed, right? Had a bad day at work, I'm stressed. I've been having a rough patch with my wife, right? Or my spouse. That's your boss is a pain in the ass, or your employees are a pain in the ass, right? That's what most people think of as stress. And that is one piece of it. And that can be a massive piece for some people there. And talk about genetics here. There's a huge genetic component to this in terms of how some people respond to stress. This is where things like PTSD really can start to play a big role, right? Because if you did have some sort of traumatic experience at some point in your life, and maybe that hasn't necessarily been dealt with, but you're likely going to have a heightened response. You're probably going to have a heightened response to similar stressors, maybe all stressors too, but you're likely also dealing with a little bit of a smaller stress bucket so you can handle less stress here. Now, again, that's out of my scope of practice in terms of how to handle that. But again, I can still make a case for how that is impacting that is lowering your stress bucket. And it does come back to either in some form or fashion, an overflowing stress bucket, whether it's from too many stressors, a heightened stress response to certain stressors, or just a small stress buckets or a small capacity to handle stress. But let's talk about, so first we have psychological and emotional stress. So this is your work stress. This is your worry. This is your anxiety. This is your relationships, your life pressures, lack of control. Again, as I said, the downside with this is if we're working with a small bucket here, or we've always had a small bucket and then maybe something happened early in our life and it really didn't allow us to expand that stress capacity bucket. Something like anxiety could be something where it's like you're at a increased risk of anxiety, and then anxiety is going to continue to lead to this, right? So then again, that's where we would need to look at, okay, where are other stressors coming at in this person's life? But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Again, some of these do lead to them in themselves will add stress, but then they can also, having an overflowing stress bucket can also lead to you having a higher risk of these things as well too, right? From work stress, worry, anxiety, right? Because as I was saying earlier, if we don't ever lower that stress bucket, reduce what's getting poured into it, and it's constantly overflowing and or we're not building it, every stressor that maybe you had in the past is now becomes a larger stressor. So again, work stress, maybe again, you have this smaller stress bucket, it's overflowing. Again, maybe you had that stressor that in the past didn't really bother you too much, but now it's like, you got other stuff going on. We'll talk about what those are. And then now that is a big trigger there. So again, some of this can compound and it can be synergistic as well too. Then we have physical stress. People know that's, but a lot of times people think that they're different buckets, but they do all fall into the same bucket. So physical stress, so hard training is a stressor on the body. Too much exercise, right? When we're doing a lot of training or we're training super hard, that is going to be a stressor. Any training will be a stressor on the body for sure, right? Obviously, the more you do, the higher the intensity is of that, the larger it's going to take up. And again, that by itself isn't necessarily bad, but then it comes down to, okay, where's all the other stress coming from? This is why people that maybe are professional athletes, they probably have a large bucket. They've probably built that up over time, but they also have less external stress, right? They do have their own stressors. And this is where, let's take an athlete, like there's a huge genetic component to this stress bucket. They could just be someone that this genetically has a higher bucket to start, right? So they can handle more stress, they can do more. But generally speaking, this is why people that are professional athletes or do things at a high level from an athletic or training standpoint, this is why they can do so much training, is because their main goal is that's what's going to fill their bucket. Whereas you take someone who's 30 plus, they have family, kids, full-time job, financial stress. You start to see where now they don't have the capacity to be able to handle as much training because this all falls into the same bucket here. But you could also say that lack of physical activity, lack of training is also a stressor on the body. While training itself will add to the stress bucket, if you're not doing any training, that's also going to add to it as well. So there probably is that sweet spot in terms of volume intensity for some people where it's like, hey, this is enough to where obviously you're not getting the benefits of not being physically active, but you're also not overdoing it there. But this also, again, is why it's important for us to focus on things outside of the gym so you can be able to handle more. Because now you can start to see where if we go back to, hey, you're doing a lot of training, but if you also have some of these other stressors, you have a lot of life stress, now it's going to be harder for you to build muscle. And then again, if you're consistently pushing that, yeah, you're working hard, but your stress bucket's overflowing. So yeah, you might be putting in the work and you might be working hard, but again, the goal is to increase your stress bucket, but also decrease what is going in there. So we have too much training and then too little. But you could put things like injuries as a stress. Obviously, if you do have injuries, that's going to add to your stress bucket. Illness, obviously, that's going to be a huge stressor when we're sick. Surgery and whatnot, like that will fall under physical stress. Then we have body composition stress. So this is where if you're very low body fat percentage, that's going to be a stressor on the body, or high body fat percentage. So if your body fat is too high, both of these will be stressors. So that's where we want to kind of find that kind of sweet spot, right? with body fat percentage. For men, it's usually about 10 to 20%. For women, it's somewhere between 20, 30% there. And don't get too caught up in exact numbers because it is going to be somewhat different from everybody. However, I think that is a sweet spot to be for most people. But again, chronic dieting is a stressor on the body. Being in a deficit is a stressor on the body. For some people, that may be the thing that we need to do to lower body fat percentage. So in that case, that's probably going to outweigh that. But this also shows that, again, we just have to understand that is a stressor on the body. And so that has to be accounted for. The quicker you lose weight, the larger the deficit is, the larger that stress response is to that. And then, so those would be some body composition things. And you could even argue that even a surplus is a stressor on the body, right? Obviously, the larger it is, the larger the stress is. And then now you also have the compounding effect of more body fat, the larger your surplus is, and that can start to impact things there, especially if you start to go too high in body fat percentage, right? And then same thing, right? If you're dieting and then you get super lean, like that's a huge stressor to the body. Anyone who's dieted and or gotten super lean in that process can tell you that they don't feel as great there, right? Training's not as good, et cetera. And then we have nutrition, poor food quality, right? Probably eating processed foods are probably adding a little bit of stress to the body. Nutrient deficiencies, likely decreasing that bucket a bit, but also increasing stress on the body. You could put alcohol in there. Alcohol is definitely going to add to your stress bucket. It's probably going to itself add to the stress bucket, but then the downstream impacts of alcohol as well too, right? Likely a higher heart rate, poor sleep, these things. Sometimes you do one thing and it also adds stress elsewhere as well too there. A large blood sugar swing. So how this would show up is, again, you don't have like good, maybe your meal composition is not great. You have blood sugar swings and by themselves aren't necessarily bad. They need to be controlled, et cetera. But the larger they are, the longer they stay up, or the more word I'm looking for, the more up and down they are, like drastic changes, more that is going to add some stress. So again, you do it one time, not problematic. You have one meal where maybe you eat just high carbohydrate, high quick digesting type carb with no movement around it. Yeah, that will add a little bit of stress. But again, if you're otherwise overly healthy, you have a stress bucket that's regulated, you're probably in a good spot. However, where it can become problematic, again, is where that happens for long periods of time, right? So this would be consistently having high blood sugar, high blood glucose levels there. Having high insulin levels, like that would be another thing, right? It's like maybe your blood glucose is in a stable spot, but because of the things that you've been doing, maybe again, your blood sugar has had a lot of those swings, it's gone up, or again, your body's a little bit more resistant to insulin. Now there's higher amounts of insulin in your body, and that itself can be a stressor on the body, right? So we can start to see where nutrition plays a big role here. Then we have gut health. So poor digestion, intolerances, GI infections, constipation, diarrhea, dysbiosis. These are all going to be things. So your gut health is going to add to the stress bucket. And probably what it does with that is that it's going to be any sort of gut stress is going to lead to this kind of low systemic chronic inflammation, right? And that's obviously a stressor on the body. Inflammation is good. We do need a healthy immune response. Healthy inflammation response is good. But again, when it's chronically elevated and or just even small amounts, like that is going to add to your stress bucket and likely decrease the capacity of your bucket as well too. So again, we need to look at gut health. So gut stress is going to be there. So anything that, again, this is an interesting one because what's going to lead to poor gut health? Again, I think like super quick eating, poor food choices, alcohol, maybe certain food tolerances you have, consistently doing that. Poor sleep is going to increase your risk of poor gut health, right? So again, some of these things are interchangeable and that you don't get good sleep. That's a stressor in of itself. That's going to lower your bucket. And then you also have the gut side of things coming into it in there. So you can see where there's going to be multiple players here and multiple things are going to start to impact it there. And then we have sleep quality and circadian rhythm habits. So poor sleep quality, your regular sleep schedule, shift work, jet lag, poor light exposure. These are all going to be stressors on the body. Again, if you do have shift work, you likely are already working you're getting a lot of stress poured into that bucket there. And you probably also have a little bit of a smaller bucket. So somebody who does shift work, like that's going to be problematic. That's going to impact how lean you can get. That's going to impact how much you can train there, right? So you can't also have shift work and then train marathon volumes as well too. And the thing with circadian rhythm, that's also going to then impact your sleep quality, right? So now you're not getting good sleep quality. So I do think circadian rhythm is a huge thing that really can set you up to have your body be in a much better spot to be able to, it's just going to be in a more efficient and it's just going to run more smoothly when our circadian rhythm is in check there. And then we have inflammation, right? There's things that we can do that are likely more pro-inflammatory food choices, like you said, alcohol. At the same time, a lot of these things lead to inflammation, right? And so a tricky one where it's, is it the chicken or the egg? But either way, that is a stressor on the body. And again, we do know that the inflammation process is a good thing. We do need it to heal and recover. But again, chronically, it being higher than what it would like to be, even just a little bit, can start to lead to some dysregulation with that system, right? And so this is where you may potentially start to see some autoimmune issues and things like that there. And again, some people are just going to be more predisposed to certain conditions, right? Especially autoimmunity. Women are going to be at a higher risk of any of these issues. And so that's why I think with women in particular, watching the stress bucket is super important, because once this is overflowing, you're going to be at even higher risk of those things. And then our environmental, these are things that I do think are somewhat important to look at, but you do need to, I think we can start to feel like we can't ever do anything if we overly focus on these. But we are looking at toxins, pollution, extreme temperatures, poor air quality, lack of nature, MF exposure, plastics. Like, these are things that you do probably want to pay attention to it, but you can drive yourself crazy with these. But you could throw mold in here. That's definitely can be problematic for some people. Only that's a huge stressor on the system, right? So really the main point of this is those are all the ways that we can add stress to the body. It's not just, oh, hey, I feel stress. And so I think when we start to think of it that way, you can start to look at yourself and be like, all right, here's where I can, maybe where I am starting to have more of this creep up. I actually have a little bit more stress on my body than I think I do there, right? Again, if let's say we're experiencing some sort of gut health, right? You're experiencing some sort of constipation. You can understand that there is some sort of stressor on the body that's likely causing that, right? And so then you can think back to, okay, now the time to really try to push training as much as possible. But I think from there, then really it comes down to where can I take out what's getting poured in to the stress bucket, right? And one thing I didn't mention earlier that we can look at in terms of more short term are some of these things, like I said, libido starting to decrease, getting some menstrual cycle dysregulation, consistently having poor mood, feeling fatigued. But we can also look at things like resting heart rate and HRV. So with resting heart rate, it's not, we want to see what your baseline is. And then when you start to see it trend up or consistently be above what that baseline is, I would say 3 to 5 beats or higher from what your baseline is. That's where, again, we're likely starting to experience a bucket that is getting pretty close to overflowing or potentially overflowing. And then HRV, same thing. You need your baseline. And then if it's consistently lower than what it is, again, a sign that now we are starting to have our stress bucket is starting to overflow there. So what we need to do, so now what we're going to do here is we're going to go to 2 ways to keep the bucket from overflowing. And it comes down to 1, reduce what's getting poured in. So these are our inputs. And then the second is going to be, we want to increase the size of our bucket. However, we can't just increase it. There are some things that we need to do. And then there is obviously one thing that is very powerful in terms of increasing the size of your bucket. So let's talk about what gets poured in, right? I think the first thing we need to do no matter what before we can really push increasing of the size of our bucket is we need to figure out, reduce what's getting poured in. What are the biggest sources of stress on our body? If it is psychological and emotional, are there some things that we can implement to work on that? Hey, maybe I do need to give myself some downtime. Maybe I need to add in some breathing work. Maybe I need to go see somebody for this. Maybe I need to work on slowing down versus trying to add in more, right? Maybe I need to set boundaries in relationships. Maybe I need to set boundaries in work relationships. Maybe I need to take on less overall. I need to audit the things that I'm taking in, because if I'm doing that, that's going to decrease the amount that you're able to do here in terms of training. And that obviously is going to impact your ability to change your body there. Obviously, big one is improve sleep quality and circadian rhythm habits. That's going to take a lot of stress off the body. So if we can improve that, again, we'll probably increase our bucket a bit on that depending on where we're at, but we'll definitely reduce what's getting poured in. We need to train smart and manage training load. So this is where you need to look at, okay, am I doing any training? Okay, if I'm not, I probably need to start getting some movement in, as that will really help our ability to buffer some stress. However, if we're constantly doing a ton of training super intense, we may need to look at dialing back on either intensity or the volume of training we're doing for a period of time. This doesn't mean you have to do this forever, but we need to stop that bucket from overflowing for some period of time. And so for some people, it's training smarter and managing that training load. We need to improve our diet quality base and probably reduce ultra processed food consumption. If this is you, right? If you don't do any of that, then maybe that's not necessarily your problem, right? So some of this is, you need to see where your sources of stress are coming from. And we need to support our gut health. So whether that is breathing practices, whether that's slowing down when eating, whether that's making sure you're staying hydrated, which is another stressor on the body too, right? Being dehydrated. I didn't add that in there. I would put that under nutrition. And a big one too. If you're just dehydrated, that is going to that's going to be stress that's getting poured into the bucket there. So we do want to figure out ways that we can support the gut, because if we're having gut issues, we can already assume that there's a good amount of stress going into the bucket. Get to better body comp ranges. So again, if you're trying to live super lean, that is a stressor on the body, and you may need to increase your body fat percentage a bit to lower that stressor on the body. Now, again, you have to take a very system-wide approach here. You can't just look at one thing and be like, oh, if I just gain a couple pounds and gain a little bit of body fat, all my problems will go away. That could be, right? It just depends on how big of a stressor it is on you compared to everything else, right? But improve body composition. So if you're at higher body fat levels, for you may need to, one thing that you can add in is to get to lower body fat percentage. Now, how we get there, that's a whole nother story, right? That we would have to dive into with that. Try and limit your environmental stressors. If there's things that you just know you can dial back on there, if you do use plastic and heat up plastic, right? Like that would be an easy fix. If you don't filter your water, maybe you do that. So there are some things that we can do here to help limit that. there. Alcohol, right? Like I would throw alcohol. If you're having a lot of alcohol and you feel like your stress bucket's overflowing, that would be a place that I would look at reducing that there. So we need to reduce what gets poured in, but we have to understand that it's more important to figure out what are like the low-hanging fruit things here. So again, if you are doing a lot of things but you like training, then first I think maybe we need to look at, let's decrease how much responsibility you're taking on. Let's set boundaries with your relationships, right? It really comes down to knowing what's going on in the person's life, in your life, and then being like, okay, what are the low-hanging fruit things here that I can do that are going to help take off the most stress? And the cool thing with some of this is, let's say, for example, you're having some gut issues, but then we see that your circadian rhythm's out of whack and you're training a ton. Maybe for you, we just dial back training volume a little bit in intensity and we work on your circadian rhythm, and boom, that takes care that those two things also take care of the gut health. Sometimes there's certain things that we can do that will impact other things, right? So you don't necessarily always have to, for example, if it's a gut health thing, you don't necessarily always have to just do a gut intervention. You could do other things there. Maybe for you, you have a lot of alcohol. So that to me is probably the first thing that we need to work on before we worry about any of these other things, because that will likely take a lot of stress off the body right there, right? So again, you can see where it starts to, if somebody is trying to get lean, they need to get lean for something. Then we need to figure out, okay, maybe it's work-life stress, maybe it's circadian rhythm, maybe it's we need to support our gut better. Maybe we need to add in a little bit more nutrient-dense food, set up your meal timing better. So again, there's just a lot of different examples of how this can change from person to person. So that's what we need to figure out, where we can reduce that. From there, then the goal becomes, all right, in some of these things we can do in combination, right? So like I talked about one thing in this, expanding our bucket, because again, we want to expand this bucket over time. Getting enough sleep, if you are very low in sleep and circadian and you have a lot of circadian disruption, obviously getting better sleep will be something that will likely increase that bucket and will probably reduce some stress. So something like sleep is going to be huge in this situation, right? But there are some things that you can't just sleep your way to a larger bucket. Once you kind of maximize that, you can't just keep increasing the bucket from there. But there are some other things that we can do that can keep increasing that bucket. So let's talk about that. So that's the next thing now is, all right, we reduce what's poured in. Now that we've reduced what's getting poured in, now we have that ability to now expand that bucket. But if that bucket's consistently overflowing, you have to get that to stop first before you can increase the bucket, right? Because one of the most powerful things to increase the capacity here is going to be improving your cardiovascular fitness. But if you're trying to increase your cardiovascular fitness with an overflowing bucket, you're just not going to be able to do it because you're adding stress to the system. And so again, that's why it's important to figure out where that's coming from, where those stresses are, get those down, and then you can start to really focus on increasing the bucket here with that. All right, so increase the size of our bucket. That's going to be our next step once we get that down. Again, like I said, the most powerful thing we can do is improve our cardiovascular fitness. And it's going to lead to improved stress tolerance, and you're just going to be able to handle more. You're going to be able to recover from training more, right? Now, the key with this is we can't just go balls to the wall. We have to moderate our intensity, right? Because as we talked about before, just doing too much training, and then if that bucket's overflowing, you're not going to be able to adaptation is going to be much slower. It's going to be much harder, and there's going to be a big recovery cost to that. Improving our cardiovascular fitness will increase this bucket there. Now, again, do you need to do marathon levels worth of training? No. But you probably need to do at least a couple of days of cardio where you do get your heart rate up. But again, like I said, the key is making sure you don't overdo it either. But I think the more you can do, the more volume you can do, it's probably going to be better. But again, the more volume you do, you really have to watch your intensity there. We need a good base of muscle. So again, making sure we have that good base. And a lot of people have more muscle than they think they do, especially people that tend to be a bit overweight. I don't mean to be mean there on that, but it's generally speaking, people that are a bit overweight, have higher BMIs, tend to think they have more muscle than they actually do. And they think that they're just bulky because they have a lot of muscle, but really it's just a little bit more body fat than they think. It is important to spend some time building a good base of muscle. Obviously, our recovery capacity. We talked about sleep, circadian health, downtime, breath work. This can all increase the size of that bucket. And this is one that, again, if we're not doing these things that before, you probably can increase the size of that bucket while you're still reducing what gets poured in. So that's why something like sleep, circadian rhythm, and managing stress is probably going to be something universally good that you want to do all the time, right? Because it is probably going to increase that bucket a bit. But as I was saying, you can only do so much stress management, recovery stuff, right? You can't just recover your way to a bigger bucket, but you can increase it a bit, but there's going to be diminishing returns, right? Because you can't just meditate for 24 hours and expect to have a big bucket, because now you're missing everything else there. Proper breathing mechanic. This is going to be something that is going to increase the size of your bucket. And this is probably another thing that you can add in while your bucket's overflowing, and it will likely increase the capacity a bit. But again, you can't just breathe your way to a bigger bucket, right? All these are going to have limiting effects here. But in saying that, it's probably a good idea to do all the things I mentioned so far It's good to do them. It's just we're going to have to moderate how much training we can do until we get the buckets from overflowing there. Nutrition quality and adequate calories. So again, this is where we need to periodize our calorie intake, right? If we're always eating in a deficit, we're likely not going to maximize our bucket, right? It is likely going to be a bit smaller if we're always underfueling and never feeling enough there. But again, making good food choices, making sure we get all our micronutrients in like that can increase that bucket a bit there. And then mindset and stress resilience, working on your mindset, right? That's going to increase your buckets. Doing things like therapy, CBT, mindset strategies, improving your emotional regulation. These are all going to be things that are going to increase it, but also slowly getting yourself uncomfortable and doing stressors that just get you outside of your comfort zone over time are going to increase that bucket. But again, the key though is it needs to be slightly outside your comfort zone. You can't just go and do something that is way out of what you've done, way super uncomfortable, and you're not ready for, because that is just going to add stress and it's definitely not going to increase your bucket right there. And then again, genetics are going to help us figure out our starting point and likely how large we can get our bucket. I think a lot of people have, from what has happened to you in the past, genetic, and then there's the genetic. We probably have a lot of wiggle room here to be able to grow our stress bucket, but some people are just going to be capped off. Some people are just not going to be able to handle as much as somebody else, right? Now we can train it and we can train it over time. But again, as it gets bigger and bigger, it's like you have to become, like just with anything, once you get closer to your genetic ceiling with things, it's like the return on investment just gets exponentially tougher as you think about it as building muscles. Everybody has that genetic set point. We have a long way to go before we can get to that set point, and there's probably a lot of things you can do before you can get there. But again, the closer you get to it, the harder it is to continue to build more there. And remember, what you've had happen to you in the past is going to be huge here. If you've had some sort of trauma or anything like that in the past, that could reduce that bucket. Now, again, this is a little bit out of my scope of practice. Can you raise that over time? Probably. But again, just understand that you're likely working with a smaller bucket and it's probably going to be harder. The smaller the bucket is, the harder it's going to be to get out of that cycle, right? So we do need to look into that. Again, let's just take someone maybe that has had some sort of trauma in the past, and because of that, their bucket's always been smaller, and then any stressor they've had has really impacted them, and they haven't really ever gone out of their comfort zone. They've always lived super, super comfortable. Maybe they don't exercise because of that. Just take someone maybe on the extreme here of they've just always been inside their whole life. They've never left. They don't have relationships. For them, that bucket's going to be really small. They're not going to be able to handle much. And any stressor that they do have is going to be massive, right? That's obviously the super extreme here on that, but you can see where that starts to impact things here. And that's why I'm saying, as I've learned more about all this stuff, I really feel like any sort of issue somebody has, we can trace back to a small bucket and a overloaded stress bucket. Now, what we're working with here is going to be different from person to person, but this is a body composition podcast, fitness podcast. And so I do want to stay in my lane there with that. So that's what we're going to do to increase that. And then once we've increased that bucket, now we can put more in, and how we're able to adapt better, right? Not every stressor is going to impact us as much. You're less likely to have your willpower be lower. Again, everyone's still going to deal with those things, especially maybe as you really start to fill up that bucket. And again, maybe this is somewhat moldable in terms of the time of year, life experiences that you have going on, right? If you start to maybe fall off on your cardiovascular fitness, maybe that bucket shrinks back a little bit, right? So I do think it depends on what you have going on. And then there's obviously going to be certain times of life where your maybe work stuff is going to start to take up a bigger bucket, and you have to adjust over time. So it's not this like thing where you figure it out once and it's all solved. It's probably going to be an ongoing thing. It's probably going to go up and down a little bit, but these are all things that we can do to help keep us on track here. Because again, when that bucket's overflowing, it's just going to be not impossible, but it's going to be very challenging to lose body fat. It's going to be very challenging to build muscle. And so again, we really need to figuring out how to manage your overall stress load is just super important. So again, the goal is balance, right? We need to manage what goes in. We want to increase our bucket over time, which is going to lead to more adaptation, better health, and better performance. Remember, you can't eliminate all stress, but you can control how much you take on and how big your bucket is. And again, stress is necessary and even beneficial, but we do need to learn how to better manage it and have the capacity to handle it. Again, I hope this was helpful because, like I said, I think if you are struggling with any sort of issue from like a fat loss resistance, not building as much muscle as you need to do an audit of where am I at? Look at these sources of stress and then see, are there things I can do to increase my bucket? And then are there things that I can do to reduce what gets poured in? So then that way my body's in a better position to be able to change. And like I said, with adaptation, the fat loss and muscle gain, it's likely some direct effects where your body is probably going to just be a little bit more frugal with losing body fat and wanting to add muscle. But it's also indirect in that a lot of these things also will indirectly impact it. Again, lower willpower, lower motivation, which is going to show up in your choices over time there, right? So I hope this was helpful. If you guys have any questions on this, reach out to me on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. That's where I'm most active on social media. If you could leave a rating and review, this will help more people find this podcast. So hope you guys enjoyed this one. Talk to you guys soon.